You don't have to be an energy expert to know the importance of energy in our day-to-day lives. It has shaped modern industrial economies and will be critical for developing nations as their citizens seek higher living standards. Energy policy enacted here in the United States plays a significant role, not only here in the U.S., but internationally, given the size of the United States as a producer and consumer. As such, the results of the upcoming elections in the United States will be an important factor in the future of energy markets. The Baker Institute Center for Energy Studies has been a trusted voice for policymakers and energy companies as they navigate the uncertainties of the world of energy. The center has just released its first ever Energy Insights, a comprehensive 110-page collection of articles that provide insights rooted in data-driven research on a variety of energy and sustainability topics for decision makers to reference. This is going to prove valuable as elections approach and a new administration, along with a new Congress, come into office in 2025. Now, today, I'm joined by Ken Medlock, Senior Director of the Center for Energy Studies, and the Institute's James A. Baker III and Susan G. Baker Fellow in Energy and Resource Economics. I'm David Satterfield, Director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. Ken, thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure.
What was the motivation of the center, of you, behind producing this new publication?
It's a great question. We decided to do Energy Insights really to highlight in a different way the depth of research that is being done in different programmatic areas across the center. A lot of times when you look at the research from the center, you only see what you gravitate towards. So if, for example, you're in the natural gas industry, you'll see when we do something that's connected to natural gas. If you're in electric power, similar. You'll see something that we do that's directed towards electric power. But in truth, we're doing things that are rooted in sustainability, in transportation, in electricity and gas, and oil, in geopolitics, a lot of depth in geopolitical analysis of different things on the energy and energy transitions fronts, particularly in Eurasia, in the Middle East, in Latin America. So we have our fingers in a lot of pies, and this was just a way to kind of bring it all together so that our audience can actually see the depth and breadth of what we do.
Do you look to do this as an annual?
Absolutely. This is something that we will continue to do every year. Again, just as a way to really bring together all the different voices that are resonating here on matters related to energy and sustainability, because this is a complex set of issues and there's a lot of interconnections between the issues that if they're missed, they can lead to some serious unintended consequences.
You highlight 5 key initiatives in the report. What are they? Why are they, to you, to the center, the critical areas of focus?
So we launched around our programs several initiatives that are really cross-cutting. One of which is the future of oil and gas. It's not really ho-hum, but it's something that everybody's looking at and trying to grapple with and understand. But beyond that, we get into the future of fuels, which is really a transportation-focused initiative. How will different modes of transport evolve as transitions unfold, as new technologies are integrated? This is a wide open question that our friends at ports, in the rail industry, in trucking and passenger transport, they're all wrestling with. And it's not just about the modes of transport, it's also about the supply chains that support them, which is something a lot of times people don't always internalize when they're trying to wrestle with what might come to pass. But we also have a significant initiative on sustainability and resilience. This is really about taking a systems level approach to understanding what sustainability means. So it's not just about hitting certain environmental markers, it's also hitting certain socioeconomic markers, also hitting certain commercial and financial markers. Because if you ask company A to do something in the interest of promoting an economic or environmental benefit, if that company cannot do that and make money, at the end of the day, that company will not survive, in which case all of the efforts that you're putting that company towards achieving will fall down. And that's really fundamentally why it's important to think about things from a systems level approach, because you have to connect all the dots. The materials transition is another major initiative. And this was really spawned by one of our fellows who pointed out, look, if we're going to do the types of things that are being aspired to do, in particular move away from petroleum-based fuels and fossil fuels more generally. You also have to think about where all of the materials that support day-to-day activity, commercial, industrial, personal, where they come from. Because the petroleum industry is embedded in almost everything we do. It's embedded in the materials and the lubricants and the plastics, all the different things, resins that you use when you think about wind turbines and solar farms. And so you've got to think about materials transitions as well. And then finally, an initiative that's really focused on understanding regional perspectives around transitions, because every region is different. The energy transitions that unfold in the Houston, Texas region are going to look very different than the ones that unfold in Beijing or in London or in New York. And understanding why is of critical importance, so policymakers don't try to paint with one broad brushstroke, and understand how those complexities and differences can yield benefits.
Ken, you've just touched on both these issues, but in the energy sector, two words that you read continuously: transition and sustainability. And I know the report hits on both of these. Talk a little bit about how one manages not just a transition, because that's natural, it's occurring, but the question of sustainability as you factor in all the complex variables that affect whether, how, and at what pace the transition can occur, sustainability be achieved in different sectors, from plastics to sources of fuel and energy.
That is fundamentally the basis of a lot of the research that we're doing, trying to unwind that complexity and take it in bite-sized chunks so that you can explain how, well, if we focus on, for example, medical plastic waste, how do we actually do that in a way that's sustainable, that actually avoids imposing certain types of encumbrances in Gulf Coast communities, for example? These are the types of issues that we're continually grappling with. There are solutions that are out there, but they're not immediately obvious. And remarkably, when we've had some conversations around that particular subject, you see that folks in the medical industry don't necessarily connect themselves to the petroleum product space. Not really fully internalizing that things that come down and impact what petrochemical industries can do will ultimately impact the medical services industries from being able to do what they want to do. And so sustainability is about ensuring that those supply chains remain whole, ensuring that all of these enterprises which provide, in this case, life-saving benefits, are not disrupted in a way that disables their ability to do what they naturally do. So it's an area of ongoing exploration, and every single industry is different.
But Ken, whatever the industry may be, plastics to classic hydrocarbons, there has been a focus at the political level internationally and in Washington on deadlines, carbon neutrality, carbon zero. But those deadlines, as your center makes clear and has made clear, are based upon market realities, realities of technology and infrastructure, rather than an arbitrary calendar deadline. How do you fold this all in to the work that you do?
So the first thing you have to do is recognize, and I actually just lectured about this morning in class, you have to recognize that there are three critical words that have to be internalized in any conversation around hitting those marks: legacy, scale, and technology, right? So legacy is really about, when you talk about the energy space, you have to recognize that you're talking about very large, very long-lived infrastructure. When I build a power plant, when I build a petrochemical facility, when I build a refinery, it's not for the next 2 to 5 years. It's for the next 30 to 50 years. So it's a very different time scale that you ultimately end up talking about. So if I build one of those massive pieces of equipment to actually perform the services that we desire them to perform, so economic activity advances unimpeded, right? I have to realize that I'm setting down a massive set of pavement that I'm going to be walking on for the next 3 to 5 decades. Once I internalize that, then I can start to wrestle with scale. How big are these things? How much money does it take to turn these things over and actually replace them so that I can continue to do the things I normally do as a consumer and not be disrupted, right? Once I wrestle with that, then I start to realize, well, technology actually moves the needle along the periphery of both of those things. So capital investment is the vehicle for technology deployment. This is very different, there's these three concepts, or these three words, from if I have a conversation about the telecoms industry, for example. Telecommunications can transition much more rapidly because you're talking about infrastructure legacies and scales that aren't as large and aren't as long-lived. So most of us have a mobile phone. We'll usually have that for 18 to 24 months until Apple comes out with the next latest and greatest iPhone, and there's a line around the block waiting to get into the store to buy the new one when it launches, right? But you don't do that with cars. You don't do that with ovens. You don't do that with refrigerators. And you sure as hell don't do that with petrochemical facilities, power plants, and refineries. So you're talking about a completely different time scale. Internalizing all of that makes it a lot easier to rationalize how change will matriculate. And once you get to that point, then you can understand where the opportunities lie for rapid transition, maybe when we're approaching the end of a current legacy. So for example, with a coal-fired generation infrastructure in the United States, the last major build-out was between 1978 and 1982, 40-year design life on most of that stuff. Where are we today? We're at a position where coal can rapidly be transitioned away from. And so you're seeing that. But if you're in China, where most of the coal capacity is less than a decade old, it's a different story.
Got it. Ken, another area that's attracted a great deal of attention and work by the center is in mining, critical minerals, rare earths. So what are some of the biggest issues the U.S., the global community is facing in this sphere? How difficult is it to bring these items to market, and some thoughts on the PRC as a factor in the entire area?
So this is perhaps one of the most complicated issues in the energy transition realm, because we have to recognize that rare earths, critical minerals, metals are vital for expanding electrification of everything we do. From wind turbines to solar panels to battery technologies to transmission to electrifying things downstream of the generation post. You need all this stuff. Electric vehicles. The metals load in an electric vehicle dwarfs that in an internal combustion engine vehicle, so where does the metal come from? All of these things matter, right? Copper, for example. So you get to a point where you recognize you're talking about mined resources, so you have to develop mines. Well, the United States really hasn't been in a leadership role in terms of developing mines, so you end up ultimately moving to countries in Latin America, like Chile, for example, where there's a lot of copper production, lithium production, you name it, right? Things that we need for these transitions to continue to evolve. And then you recognize, well, you can get the raw materials, but you still have to process them, right? And turn them into what's usable as an intermediate input into development of batteries and electric vehicles and everything else. And that's where China becomes integrated into the discussion, because they took a very directed national approach to capturing what they viewed as a comparative advantage, is controlling those supply chains. And they made investments over the past couple of decades to do exactly that. And so they're in the driver's seat right now. And that, of course, brings this full circle if you're sitting in Washington, D.C., or in most other countries in the West right now, of feeling like your national security and your energy security, as transitions continue to unfold, is compromised by Chinese dominance of supply chains. So it is something that has risen to the top of the geopolitical context. It is definitely on the minds of all of the investors that are at different points on these supply chains, from the Fords and GMs all the way down to the Siemens and Emersons of the world, right? So it's a centerpiece, it's a focal piece of transitions discussions, and it's going to remain so for a while, because it takes a long time to build this stuff.
You yourself authored one of the 15 energy insights in the report, titled Engines of Change, Innovation, and Growth. What is the potential impact of new energy technologies, and on what time frame?
So energy is always under transition. That is not new. The interest in developing quote unquote disruptive technologies has accelerated over the last decade or so. And I'm going to pause there for a second, because there's a really important point that goes back to something I said earlier about legacy and scale. The more capital intensive an industry is, and the energy industry is incredibly capital intensive, the less likely it is to see a disruptive technology emerge. And that's because a disruptive technology to emerge has to not only overcome its own fixed cost of adoption, It also has to overcome the stranded costs associated with leaving something in its wake. If it cannot do both, it's not going to get picked up as rapidly as it will if it can do both. And so that limits the scale and scope of what new technology can do. That said, the technologies that can find their way into a market that immediately, quote unquote, strap into a particular place in a market and don't disrupt the supply chains that are required to support them can have massive impacts very rapidly. Two great examples of this are wind and solar. Because you're talking about the development of a technology that could literally connect itself into a well-developed, well-supported grid infrastructure and overcome barriers associated with intermittency and launch the entire US grid in a completely new platform. So those are the types of technologies that can succeed very quickly and be transformational.
Ken, there's an enormous public debate, governmental discussion on electrification, move away from fossil fuels, the electric vehicle EV market issue. You've talked about some of the factors that affect those EVs, the metal load, battery, there are environmental costs and very high ones to these things, and the PRC issue. Well, let's talk a bit about consumers. What role do consumers play in an adoption, all those other factors notwithstanding, of a very different new technology that will become a part of their daily lives?
Consumers are the determining factor, plain and simple. So,
not government declarations?
No, not government declarations. You have to have consumer uptake for it to work. Right now, you see that most electric vehicle cells, and this is a right now statement, right? Because this could change 10 years from now, right? It could look very different looking back. But at present, most electric vehicle cells have been to upper middle and upper income homes. That effectively means your market is segmented to a particular consumer class. To get broader uptake, you need to actually drive down the cost of electric vehicles so that it can begin to step into middle income and lower middle income households. Because the one thing you always have to realize is the second largest capital expense that most households will make in their lifetime is their vehicle. And if it is very expensive, if it requires infrastructure to recharge, if you live in an apartment, if you live in a small home and you don't have an additional $5,000, $10,000 to install the kit to recharge your vehicle in your garage, or maybe you don't even have a garage. Now you're actually relying on other mechanisms to recharge that vehicle, and there's uncertainty around that. So as a consumer, that's going to tend to push you away from the EV purchase if you're in those lower income brackets and towards the traditional internal combustion engine vehicles. So affordability matters.
Crystal ball question to follow affordability, battery technology. What are the expectations in the industry amongst analysts of whether there is a transformational, disruptive change in battery technology anticipatable in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think on this one, it's probably going to depend on who you talk to. Fortunately, I don't have a book to speak to on this one, so I'll give you what my assessment is. Utility scale lithium ion technologies are going to continue to expand and proliferate. In Texas alone, at the beginning of this year, I think we were at around 5 gigawatts of installed battery capacity. I think by early spring next year, we're projected to be over 12 gigawatts. So it's growing rapidly. And that does have a transformational impact in terms of providing reliability services, frequency control services, which are vital for grid stability, lots of things like that. Interestingly, though, the thing that's recharging the batteries in ERCOT right now in the Texas market is natural gas. So you end up in this really interesting, well, what is the arbitrage role that batteries play? And the data are pretty self-explanatory. But I think what you're asking me is, what is the potential for a large-scale, long-duration storage technology to emerge? There's a lot of work going on in this space, and there's a lot of things that show promise, but we're still sort of in the infancy stage of those technologies, and which one's going to win, I think it's anybody's guess at this point. I think if you talk to somebody who's involved in one of the others, they'll lean toward what they're doing, obviously, but you're probably talking about, for long duration storage, a decade at least.
Are we talking about the same time frame for genuine commercial adoption of small and medium reactors on the nuclear side?
Ooh, that's a great question. The technology is ready. We know how it works. I'll give you a real simple example because this is always a fun one to talk about. We held some Chatham House Rule workshops on SMR, small modular reactor technologies, and micronuclear reactor technologies for use in mobile applications, the MNR ones in particular. And we were about 45 minutes into the dialogue, and I stopped everybody because I was really intrigued by the way they were talking about these technologies. And I asked them we just went in that room, tell me what you did before you're in your current role. Over half of the room was retired naval subcommanders. And you realize very quickly, okay, they have a very different view of these technologies because they were in these big cylindrical tubes underwater with them for most of their life prior to the role they're in now, so they understand exactly what they are. There still is a lot of learning that both policymakers and the general public need to go through to achieve acceptance, because one of the parts of the discussions that really stood out to me was there was this real enthusiastic, we can skid mount these micronuclear reactors and bring them in from a port and drive them out and run field operations. And I said, you realize if you go to Austin and you talk to a legislator, they're going to look at you and say, you're going to put what nuclear reactor on my highway? And it clicked, right? There is a regulatory spider web that needs to be unwound before these things will actually be acceptable in broad scale. So I think we have a decent runway in front of us there as well.
Last question for you, a Texas issue. Reliability of the electrical grid, from concerns that stem from Winter Storm Uri in 2021 to very recently Hurricane Beryl leaving over 2 million people without power. How does your Energy Insight paper, how does the work of the center address now these issues?
So one of our programs is heavily focused on electricity markets and policy. A lot of the work we've been doing, as you might imagine, has been very ERCOT focused just because it's in our backyard. Winter Storm Uri was very different than the derecho we experienced earlier this summer and then Hurricane Beryl. Hurricane Beryl in particular was a poles and wires issue. Winter Storm Uri was a generation outage issue. So completely different parts of the grid, different solutions that are required to ultimately overcome the challenges experienced. Part of getting to rational policies explaining all of that, right? So classic example, and I know you and I have talked about this. On the front page of the Houston Chronicle after Beryl, there were pictures of these skid-mounted gensets that CenterPoint had purchased in case they needed backup generation so they could island parts of the grid if another Uri-type event happened. Well, they sat idle in the wake of Beryl. And so this was a question that was called out in this article. And the immediate reaction to somebody who's sort of in the know is, this is a poles and wires issue. It's not a generator issue. So where exactly would you have placed those, right? There was nowhere to connect them because the wires were down. You actually had to fix the circuit before you could deploy generation assets. And so it's a massive education that needs to occur, but it's like anything else. When there's a crisis, we all tend to learn very quickly. And so hopefully in this case, we'll actually learn what it means to be resilient, because when you get to a poles and wires issue, it's a lesson in resilience. And that's really where we fell down dramatically in the wake of Beryl.
Ken, thank you very much for joining us today. To read or download the Energy Insights report, visit bakerinstitute.org/energy-insights-2024. The link is available in our show notes. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan political analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the United States, and the world. This episode was produced by Maram Hijazi and Karina Zamel. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more, and thank you for listening.